You know what? I don't want to start this way. Start over. And action. Welcome back to Show and Tell. I'm Billie. Today, my guest is Tanis Gray. Give me a moment and I'll be right back with her. Okay, so here I am back with my guest today, Tanis Gray. So, Tanis, I have interviewed a bunch of people on the show, but I've never interviewed anyone who's authored as many books as you. What's the number now? Is it 16?
16 in October, yes.
Okay. And 600 patterns you've written?
Getting close to 700, yeah.
Okay.
No, there's no achiever like an overachiever, as we say in our house.
Okay, so by way of introduction, Tanis Gray obviously is prolific in everything, but not just author and knitwear designer, mom to two young kids,
Yep.
wife to an engineer, and RISD graduate.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so I wanted to say a couple things about RISD because they've come up for me in the last week or so. Actually, early on in the pandemic, I tuned in online and found this instructor from RISD named Matthew Bird. Do you know of him?
No, I think
No.
after.
Okay, everybody drop what you're doing and go find him on YouTube. He is incredible. He wasn't able to teach because of the pandemic, so he created all of his course material online and made it available to the public. And it's mostly about industrial design, but he weaves in architecture and decorative arts, and the guy's just a genius, and he's also super entertaining. I know you would love him. So that's my first RISD connection. The second one is I recently saw a preview of a film called The American Society of Magical Negroes. And the main character is a RISD graduate, and his colleagues ridicule him by saying, "Oh, RISD, isn't that the Harvard of finger paints?"
Ouch, that cuts deep.
And then my third connection is just recently I watched this lecture online given by a guy named Ryan Bugden. He recently redesigned all of RISD's typeface.
Right. Yeah, all the banners, the logo. Yeah, just
So you know of him.
yeah.
I live a short distance from Cooper Union, and they have a lot of lectures online and also things in person. Like they get people like Nancy Pelosi, I mean, Abraham Lincoln back in the day, the Lincoln Douglas debates. And they have this big program on typeface called Type at Cooper. And he was one of their featured speakers. So, I had you in mind with all of this RISD stuff. So how much of a springboard was being a graduate of RISD to your career?
I think it was massive. I went to a different type of high school than most people. I went to an all girls private Catholic high school. And that was because the local high school in my town was too large for me. And the one my son is in middle school. There's 6,000 kids in his it is middle and high school, but that is a lot of bodies. And my high school was very similar, the local one, and I just felt like I would get lost in the crowd. And I was a lot more interested in studying and schools and not necessarily, getting out, but more making my dreams a reality. And I knew that that would not be the avenue that I would go down if I wanted that to happen. So, we discussed with my parents who were amazing and made sacrifices to allow me to go to this much smaller. We had 106 in our class, and we were the biggest class ever. And it was a college prep school. So it was all honors and AP classes. And that really got me in the mindset of like, school is my job. I'm going to work really hard, and that's how I get to, RISD and a career, and not just be, another artist kind of falling through the cracks. I had goals, and I I recognized that that was the path I would have to take. So going to a high school like that where it was very difficult, and and a lot of work really prepared me well for RISD because it's not a traditional college experience, right? Like there's not one class a day and then you can kind of party or do whatever you want. They're 8-hour studio classes, often bookended by, art history, or, if you're taking life drawing, you're going in life drawing at night as well. So I was well prepared for that time commitment and that constant work ethic. And I I never would have had the experiences that I had to get me where I am today if it wasn't for the high school experience, prepping me for the college experience, and then really sucking the marrow out of, my RISD experience, which is kind of a gross expression, but it's true. I worked 7 jobs at RISD, from tour guide. It was part of work study. I gave the college tours. I was a TA. I worked in admissions, and I got to know people and kind of kept my ear low to the ground. And the private tours sometimes resulted in a connection. And I loved the experience of not only the education, but the friends that I'm still friends with today, and just that work ethic. I don't think you get that in a traditional school. You can major in art, but at RISD, you are really narrowing down that field of study. And there's no better way to prep yourself for your future. The more kind of blinders you can put on with what you want to learn, it was I wouldn't trade it for anything. I was so lucky to have that experience. And I worked hard to get there, but I was lucky too.
So tell us about one of your first jobs. Was it Martha Stewart, the very first one after you graduated?
Yep, right out of
I
school.
mean, the doyen of crafting. Let's hear about the Martha Stewart experience.
Well, I wasn't there for very long, because as a freelancer, and she liked RISD girls working in her craft shop, for lack of a better word. She liked the work ethic that RISD students brought. And it also created almost like an alumni club. But she was in legal trouble when I started there, and that quickly escalated, which of I still think, looking back, if she was a man doing what she did, she would get a slap on the wrist. But they put her in jail, and they weren't sure her brand would survive. So I wasn't there for very long. At the same time I was there, I was also working at HBO, which was oddly enough in the same building, animating for their kids channel, HBO Family. So I was okay. I still had some freelance, and I was working at Pier 1 at night to be able to pay rent. So I was working 7 days a week, 3 jobs. And that's very typical of New York, right? We're just only the strong survive.
I was going to ask you if that was in New York, because I know over in the Chelsea Market upstairs, I don't know if that's where you were, but upstairs there are a lot of television studios. Oprah has her thing there, and NBA has their, um, I don't know, television programming there too, I think. So when you started mentioning all these places, I thought, oh, is that New York?
Yeah, it was around Bryant Park.
Bryant Park. Oh, so for those who are non-New Yorkers, Bryant Park is where the New York Public Library is situated, which brings me perfect segue. Other people who I have interviewed on this program, some of them have also authored books. And I try and get copies of the books from the New York Public Library because that's my library system. They don't always have them. Sometimes I have to request an interlibrary loan. You, on the other hand, I felt like I struck gold.
Nice. Oh,
They
nice.
had many. I think they might even have others. So I borrowed all these books, and I took the opportunity to flip through each of them. And I must say, I was really impressed that every single book starts from the premise of you may not know how to knit, you may not know how to cast on or do a yarn over or make a cable or do stranded knitting. And I think in every book, I don't know if this is true of all 16 of them, but there are wonderful illustrations. Let me try and show that.
Yeah, not in all of them. It depends on the publisher, but that is important. I like to put those in when we can. Uh, and that's why I love knitting. And it's, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Ratatouille. It's a Pixar movie
Oh,
with
yes.
a rat, anyone can cook. Well, anyone can knit. And so many people are afraid. And I always say, like, it's just sticks and string. So it is always my goal to kind of make it approachable and friendly. And, hopefully by the end of this book, you'll grow some skills and you can do it. My goal is always to be so encouraging. So when we can get those illustrations, and that's great, but it really is dependent on the publisher.
Not just sticks and string, but really, if you boil it all down, it's basically two things. You have to be able to knit and you have to be able to purl. With those two stitches, you can do most everything.
Pretty
It
much
sounds like a
everything.
song.
Yep. Yeah, and people don't realize that. I was at a Boy Scout committee meeting last night. I'm the only mom on the committee, and that's fine. I'm there to represent all the moms. And one of the dads kind of snuck over at the end. He was like, "Can you knit me this hat? I want to," and said, "Well, I will teach you how to make that hat." And he was kind of horrified. And I said, "You do all these amazing knots, and it's really no different. So we're going to be knitting that hat."
Oh, good. Ooh, I'd love to see it when it's done. Okay, so usually my first question, and I got out of sequence here, usually my first question is about where you are right now, where you live, and something in your area that if we came there as tourists, that we wouldn't find in a guidebook, something that we shouldn't miss.
Well, I'm in Northern Virginia. We're very close to DC, just a handful of miles over the Potomac. And I am currently putting new flooring in my office, which is why it looks very sparse behind me. Um, there's Northern Virginia is really interesting because we are so close to DC. Um, so I think my favorite thing in DC that I actually call out in my self-published book Capital Knits is there's this place called the Summer House, and it's really small. It's about the size of my office, which is an old bedroom, and it's a circular brick structure, and that's where all the people would go and water their horses when they were going into the Capitol building. And you kind of go down a couple steps and it's gated. It's hard to get in. It's often not open. And there's benches, but it has natural air conditioning because of it's sunken into the ground, and the brick makes it a very cool structure. And it used to have water, and now there's like wisteria growing in there. It's almost like this hidden pocket in the middle of the Capitol grounds that you would never know is there. And they had plans to build another one, but they didn't. So there's only one there. But it's kind of like a little hidden gem on the grounds of the Capitol. It's a cool place to stumble upon accidentally.
So I've only been to the Capitol a couple of times. Is it free and open to the public to wander around the grounds?
Yep. You can't get too close to the building now, because we can't have nice things because of certain people. But you can wander the grounds to a certain extent. And if you're down on the bottom, looking up at the hill, it's over to the left side. It's easy to miss. You would never know it's there unless you knew it was there.
Cool. Well, that's a good one. Thank you. Okay, productivity. I cannot honestly say in my lifetime that I have ever met anyone who has more than 24 hours in their day. But I think that you must, because you seem to be one of the very most productive people. I want to know how you're doing that. I want to know what time you wake up. I want to know what a typical day looks like for you that you can cram so much in. Who else has written almost 700 patterns? Who else has written 16 books and raised a family? Yada, 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 all these jobs, sometimes, as you said, two and three at a time juggling. How do you do that?
Well, I ask for a clone every year and I still haven't gotten one. It's just time management. I have always been, it is my superpower. I am exceptional at time management. I also have a sleep disorder, so I don't need a lot of sleep, and I use that time productively. The second I bring my kids to school, my workday starts. And it's interesting with in a sort of post-pandemic world where I would always say I worked from home, and people would be like, "Oh, how cute, you work from home." And now they understand that it is a legit way to run a business. But I take it very seriously. I have work hours, and I also have, I have a hard stop. I need to go pick up my kids, and my evening is, driving kids around to all our activities.
Tell me specifics. So what time are you waking up? What time are you taking the kids to school? And what time
So
are you picking them up?
we wake up at about 7. School doesn't start till 9 around here. So the mornings, everybody kind of does their own thing. My daughter's really into drawing. My son might practice his violin or build robots. He's really into engineering. And then I bring her to school, and I would say my workday starts at about 9:30, and it goes till I have to pick her up till 3:30 pretty much.
So that's not a particularly long workday. It's certainly not 9 to 5.
Nope. And then sometimes if I'm on something like a book deadline, when they go to bed at 9, then I might have to put a few more hours in. But again, it's that RISD and that high school work ethic of you're not done till the job is done. And I'm okay with that because that allows me to still be a mom, which to me is the most important thing. I was always really important to me to raise my own children and not have them in before care or after care or daycare. And I'm lucky that my schedule allows that.
Well, it's not luck. You designed it that way.
True. Yep. Yeah, it's probably my best design, right? Time management.
I personally have engaged in a bunch of different crafts in my lifetime. I've done macrame, I've thrown pots,
Mm.
I've crocheted, I've done embroidery, I've done a needlepoint, a bunch of different things. And actually, you and I have this in common. I did sharpen knives once upon a time, not really knives, but I took a wood sculpture course, and we had chisels, and we had to be able to sharpen the blades of our chisels. So I imagine it's similar with a stone and the oil, and you're rubbing it back and forth. So I know that that's one of your avocations, knife sharpening, but tell us about the spoon making.
I got into spoon carving right before the pandemic, and it was always something I wanted to try. I took a wood in the rounded form class at RISD where we learned how to bend wood, with building these steam boxes and cutting the wood. And, when it's hot enough and steamy enough, you can bend it and then anchoring it in a way that it dries that way. So learning how to bend wood was very interesting. And I've always kind of thought I really want to get more into that. And there's a big connection between, I'd say, fiber and wood. Learning the different types of wood is very similar to learning the different types of fiber. And Colorwork prefers protein fiber, while spoons prefer certain types of wood. You don't want to use a poisonous wood, and there are some that their sap is poisonous. So when you're carving it, you can retain some of that poison. You don't want to poison the person you made. Well, maybe you do. I don't know. But I don't want to poison the people that I'm making the spoon for. So educating myself on the different types of wood and what the proper use was. But I got really into it during the pandemic for a couple reasons. One, I was working on a book, the Star Wars book, and I needed an outlet between trying to stay on my manuscript deadline, homeschooling against my will because school was closed, and just needing something that was not work or child related. I started going outside and carving spoons. And I got really into that. And similar to your experience with your chisels, I needed to learn how to take care of my own materials. So I learned how to, use a diamond whetstone and sharpen my tools. And then I got into scissors because I quilt a lot too. And think about how many pairs of scissors that we buy over our lifetime because they just get so dull and they're expensive to have sharpened. So I learned how to sharpen scissors and tools, um and it was a really good escape for me during the pandemic to just get out there and, carve some wood. It's so different than fiber, but also very similar. So that was I'm still do it. It's fun. I really like to spoon carve.
I find it so interesting that presently, while you're doing all this knitting related stuff, that you're carving out, no pun intended, the time to do other crafts. Because for me personally, all I want to do is knit. I am like completely thrilled by knitting. If I could knit 8 hours a day and do nothing else, I would be delighted. But I'm just like mystified by your ability to take on all these other things. Do you knit for yourself? Do you knit for your kids?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think humans are curious by nature. So many of us do have all sorts of crafts that we partake in. So when your favorite craft becomes your job, it's not that I don't love knitting any less or wish that I wasn't doing it all the time. But a lot of people, especially, I hate to sound like an old person, but the younger generations, they're always talking about self-care. And when you are a mom and a wife and a full-time worker, self-care takes on a different form. So for me, still being creative in a sense that it's not deadline related, it's not for publication. It doesn't matter if I sell it, it is purely for the joy of doing it. For me, that is spoon carving and quilting. The knitting is, I love it, and I still do it all the time, but it is also work. So I need that outlet that it is not for anyone but me if I choose it to be that way. So that's where spoon carving was very important to me, to just, it was self-care. And you think a lot as you do it, and your hands kind of go on autopilot, similar to knitting. Sometimes you get into that zone, and it's just about the process. It's not even about the end result. Not, you might be on the very last step of a spoon and snap the handle, and that's it, it's done. But it doesn't matter. It's like unraveling a sweater, right? So you start again. It's part of it.
When I did pottery in college, one of the things that we were forced to do by our teacher was to slice our pot in half. So you've created this beautiful thing and now you destroy it by cutting it in half. But there's a benefit to that because you see how well you did. You see if your walls are really thin at the top, which means the rims are going to chip.
Right.
Are they uniformly thick or do they get really, bottom heavy, which makes your mug really hard to pick up and you don't have good balance. So the only way you're going to know is to slice it and see
Cross section of your
cross
work.
section. Thank you. I couldn't, I went brain
I knew
dead.
where you were getting once you were doing that. Yep.
With a nylon, like fishing line that we
Yeah.
would braid, it would just cut right through. I want to hear about your other jobs. So we know about Martha Stewart. Tell us where you segue to after Martha Stewart.
Well, I was animating for HBO, and there, my senior thesis at RISD was a rotoscoped documentary, which means you're drawing on top of existing footage. You're animating on top of live action footage about the decline of the cattle ranching industry. So, I flew out to Wyoming and filmed everything and then edited it and started drawing on top of it. So, I was doing pieces like that for HBO Family, those coming up next spots, filming local New York City kids and then drawing on top of it and, coming up next. And um, that was getting a little tricky because the freelance world was a little bit shaky. This wasn't too long after 9/11. I mean, it was the year after, really. So the world was an interesting and chaotic and very unstable place. So HBO decided to cut their freelancers due to budget concerns. So I was kind of working full time at Pier 1 and thinking this is not what I want. So I got an internship through a friend of a friend at Hungry Man Productions, which is not the fast food company or the frozen food company. It is a film production and commercial production studio. And so I started interning there and working on all these commercials and usually in the art department, props or art, and sometimes wardrobe, just, being an intern, doing what you're told. And I really loved that. And it got to the point where they were hiring me. So I was leaving the internship and becoming a real employee, so to speak. And then that's kind of segued into films. So I was working through my connections there on films and TV commercials still. Uh, Always in the art or prop department, and that was a lot of fun. It was hard work though. It's a male-dominated field. The hours are really tough. I met my husband, we were living in Jersey City. I was working in Yonkers. So the commute alone was about an hour and a half one way.
Mm.
You have to be on set at 6 a.m. and it takes a toll, right? After what you're doing what you love, but you have no home life whatsoever. So I started to look for another job after a few years of doing that and saw a listing for Vogue Knitting magazine and thought, well, I've knit almost my whole life and I'm still knitting and I love it. And maybe that'll be a good placeholder until I kind of figure out what I want to be when I grow up. So it just kind of fell into this knitting world.
And from there, the book started
Well, I
happening.
worked there for almost 5 years as the yarn editor. So I was kind of the liaison between the magazine and the designers. So the editor and I would sit down, my boss, and decide which design submissions would be in the magazine. Building stories from what we would get for submissions, and then choosing the yarn. And that's harder than it sounds because all these yarn companies constantly have new lines of yarn, just like fashion designers are always their new collection is out. So, getting the latest yarns, is it appropriate for that stitch, for that story, for that time of year? Will it be available? Is that color available? Will it be discontinued? It's hard. It's like a giant puzzle that you have to put together. And then, getting the designers the yarn. Um, a lot of them needed, moral support. I always called it hand holding, and then getting all the items in, keeping people on budget and on schedule. Sometimes things would come in that might need new buttons or another blocking, or their ends weren't woven in properly, getting everything photo ready and then getting them off to the photo shoot. So we did it when I worked there, it was kind of the height of Vogue Knitting. We did about 30 magazines a year, between Vogue Knitting, Knit Simple, Knit One, the Debbie Bliss magazine, the Noro magazine. It was a lot. And we also did books too. Six and Spring is a publication house owned by Vogue Knitting. So we were doing books as well. Um, so I was not doing my own stuff then. I was just starting to design, but I was very much an employee there working for them. So the books didn't start till after I left. My books didn't start till after I left.
Do you have any examples with you of things that you have knit?
I have maybe like one or two of my original Vogue Knitting sweaters packed away. They kept all the designs. They had an archive and would keep them. So I don't have a lot of those, but pretty much everything is on Ravelry, that because those are owned by Vogue Knitting. Only my designs are on my website. Well, not my designs that I own. Let me rephrase.
I was hoping that you had some things that you personally have knit, like for yourself, for your kids, for your husband.
I do, but because everything is packed up right now, I don't have
Oh,
anything ready
okay,
for sale.
okay.
Also,
So,
83
um,
degrees here yesterday. So there's not a lot of knitwear being worn right now, but I try to get my kids into it. My son can knit, but they're spoiled, right? They kind of place their order with me because they so rarely ask for something really specific that it's such a joy to make it for them that there's no incentive for them to make it themselves.
how
Um,
old are they now?
I'll have a 13-year-old next week and a new 7-year-old.
Well, happy birthday to the next week birthday.
Yeah, big birthday. I'm not ready for a teenager.
So I personally love architecture. I'm lucky that I live in a city that has a lot of great architecture. But in your book, Knitting Architecture, I'm really partial to Art Deco. So I like zoomed right in on this Fisher building in Detroit. So let me just read about this, and maybe you could talk about this pattern if you even remember it. I love that every pattern has a picture that inspired it, like that's the building, and then a little story. So you wrote, completed in 1928 in Detroit, the 30-story high Fisher building is a classic example of Art Deco architecture with a stair-step exterior and ornate detailing, housing a large barrel-vaulted lobby, opera house, and 21 elevators, and originally covered in golden tiles. later painted green during World War II to detract attention from bombers. The building was originally home to Fisher Body Company, a car body business acquired by General Motors. Did you go to this building in person to
I
see
did
it?
not. I
No.
I wanted to. So I had a toddler when I wrote that one. I don't know if he was even a toddler yet. My son was born 2 months early with a whole lot of special needs that come with being born 2 months early. So
Mm.
that book had a ton of research, but it was all done from my living room. A couple of them I have seen. I've seen the Pompidou Center because I've been to Paris, which is such a cool building.
That was
Um,
my other one that I like selected to show because after New York, Paris is my #2 favorite city. So you put in a little picture of a bit of the Pompidou Center, and on each pattern has like a little story about it. And here's, I mean, for people who want to know, here's that design. I'm getting a big glare from my ring light, but does being married to an engineer influence you? I mean, any of your interests?
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think a good marriage, you're always influencing each other, hopefully in a positive way. But we did have to take a certain amount of architecture classes at RISD. Architecture was a 5-year program. One of my favorite roommates was an architect, and I never saw her. It is a pretty difficult major, but I've always been fascinated by buildings. They're they're art that we live in. I mean, it's fascinating. Um, and they're not just dwellings, interested in how the inner workings are and, all the ornamentation and living in New York City for so long. You talked about the Fisher building. Well, that's the answer to the Chrysler building, right? Two huge auto giants kind of, well, you have a fancy building. I can do that too. Buildings are, they're and they're art that we live in. They're fascinating. So being married to an architect or an engineer, and at the time he was working for an architecture company, I learned a lot more about the inside, even though I knew a lot about the outside already from my RISD training. But definitely, yeah. And he's really interested in charts, and he said, like, I can't read them, but he really likes knitting charts. He thinks they're fascinating.
So when I got all these books and I started flipping through them, I kind of put them in the order that I thought I would be most interested in, from like most interested to least interested. I thought. And when I got to this one, this was the last one I looked at, gradient knitting. This book, last but not least, it blew me away.
Really?
Yes, because you touch on every single technique. It's all here. Let me see if it's in the contents. Yeah. So first you talk about just knitting and purling, then you talk about slip stitch, and it's sort of like, builds up. Alternating stripes, thrumming, which I've never done,
Um,
cabling, ferrule, intarsia, lace, modular knitting, wrap and turn short rows. I mean, that's like just about everything. And not only do you have patterns for each of those techniques, but you explain really clearly how to do it. There's always great illustrations, and it's just so beautifully laid out. I mean, anybody who wants like an introduction and overview of many, many knitting techniques, it's right here. I mean, it's not, brioche or like, other sort of like, I don't know, highbrow things. I've never done brioche personally. I don't know that I ever plan to, but like a lot of other things are right here in one handy little volume. So I was really impressed by this. I mean, the gradient part wasn't so much of interest to me because basically I do vintage knitting and things are never
right.
gradient. They're always like solid color, preferably not hand dyed. It's getting hard to find those yarns because there's so many great hand dyers. Do you have favorite yarns that you like to knit with?
Absolutely. Don't we all? I really love Little Fox, which is local to me in Virginia. She is a trained interior designer, and her whole thing is you can go up to her whole wall of yarn and close your eyes and grab any two yarns and they'll go together. And they do.
Wow.
Yeah, she has an incredible sense of color, and she's a really nice person, which to me is a bonus. Um, I really like Kim Dye's yarn. She's another local designer to me, and she does a lot of brights. I love super bright colors. If you look at my stranded color work, it's rare that it's a neutral. It's almost always really bright colors. The books are different because, for something like the Star Wars book, that dictates a palette right there of black, white, a little bit of red, a little bit of orange, but a very specific palette. Same with the Lord of the Ring books.
Love
It's
these. Sorry to interrupt you. I love this color
yeah.
combo.
Well, and those are complementary or split complementary colors. So, um, yeah, I really like the brights, but I also really like local dyers, and my best friend is a dyer, the Lemonade Shop, and she does really fun, bright, poppy colors. So I definitely have my favorites.
Well, I mean, I'm sure that we could just, schmooze and chit chat all day. Um, just one last question I would have is, you obviously have many skills in your toolbox. Are there any skills that you still would like to learn?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when you lose that thirst to learn, I mean, you may as well throw it in, right? I'm really interested in furniture design, building furniture. I have done some, but nothing complicated. Especially something like maybe a dresser where, you got to do those joined drawers, and I love puzzles. I always, it's a running joke in our family that I would be incredibly easy to kidnap because you just have to leave out a trail of puzzle pieces and I would follow it anywhere. I love puzzles more as much as I love knitting. It is my happy place doing a jigsaw puzzle. So I think there are these cool, I forget what they're called, but they're like these funky kind of almost Art Nouveau type of dressers, and that would be like a big puzzle, I think. That would be fun. My skill level is not anywhere near there, but definitely dive more into the wood world, I think, if I had, all the machinery and endless time.
Well,
Definitely.
thanks for all of that, but I really wasn't specific. I meant to ask you in the knitting
Knitting,
realm.
sorry. Um, yeah, I mean, you never stop learning. I've tried everything at least a few times. Like you, brioche is not it's not my favorite. I will knit it. And Tarja and I are never going to be friends, and that's okay. I've tried, it's like a vegetable. You can't say that you hate it until you've tried it a few times, right? Um, I just, for me, it's always stranded color work. Is my favorite to knit and design, and it's endless possibilities. So I think just continuing to dive, I'm already have dove pretty deep, but into that endless pool of stranded color work. Um, I love the history. I love knitting it and designing it, and maybe some huge scale stranded color work extravaganza. That would be fun.
What's the most number of colors you've used in a stranded color work pattern?
Probably close to 30. You can have endless colors. It's never more than two per row. If you're doing true stranded color work, never more than two per row. But if you look at someone like Alice Starmore, who is an absolute genius when it comes to stranded color work, she might have 50 colors in a sweater. But if you look at the chart, it's never more than two per row. I think that's why I also like gradients. You can kind of cheat it by going through the whole rainbow, um, and just letting the yarn do the work for you. So there is a way to kind of scoot around that and add more color that way.
Yeah, choosing colors is challenging. I have had the experience firsthand. I did a Farrell from one of Susan Crawford's books that had 9 colors in it.
Her
And
book is
I didn't like the 9 colors that were the traditional 9 colors that Jeannie Johnson had designed in 1920 something, because the main color was yellow, and yellow is just not a great color for me.
not
So I
color.
thought, okay, everybody else is doing it in the Susan Crawford colors, which were sort of like this pale yellow and like a mahogany color, which is very pretty. But I wanted to do something different. So I had to now figure out 9 colors that would have similar values to her 9 colors. And it was hard. And the result that I got, I mean, I love the sweater. It was an unbelievable amount of work, 46 stitches to 4 inches,
Wow. Yeah.
size 1 needle. But I wish I had more of that color theory background. I probably would have chosen differently. And I swatched different ways to see, okay, which ways do I like the most? Anyway, where can people find you online?
Oh, I'm like a bad penny. I always turn up. I am on Instagram probably the most, Tanis Knits, and I have a website, tanisknits.com. And there's a newsletter, and that's a good thing to sign up for because I always do coupons for new patterns, for newsletter subscribers. I'm not on X or Twitter. I kind of gave that up when it started to go awry. Um, and yeah, I'm on Threads, Tanis Knits, and Facebook too.
Is there anything that you want to tell us that I haven't touched upon?
I think my newest hobby is I've really gotten into Duolingo. Do you ever, it's a language app. So I spoke fluent French in high school. So now I'm learning Spanish and I can't read music. It's this, my husband plays the cello, my son plays the violin. You know, I can draw incredibly complicated knitting patterns, but I cannot read music. And they have a new music program. So I am learning. That was my goal this year, and I'm working towards it. I'm learning how to read music, and learning Spanish. So I'm always doing something. You know, we only get
It
one
makes
chance.
me feel like a complete slacker.
Oh, you're not. I'm just, we're given one chance in life, and I just feel there's so much I want to do. I am just an incredibly curious human, and there's so much I want to learn. So I am just trying to pack as much as I can in there, until my time is over.
Well, I have to say, not just a curious individual, but somebody with a wonderful sense of humor. And it's just been delightful. I'm so happy to have been able to meet you in person. And you know what? I forgot to ask you about that. The day that we met, it took courage to come over to you and say, hey, would you be willing to come on my show? And you didn't skip a beat. You just said yes. And it's bothered me ever since then. Like, why did she say yes so willingly? Like, I want to know what I did right that like sealed the deal, because I didn't like say very much. You were just like, yeah, I'm in.
Well, you had a beautiful sweater on, and you had done the show and share. Remember? I think it was a or you didn't have it on. It was a sailor sweater that you had just finished. A vintage pattern. I think it was white and navy.
Yes.
And it was beautiful. And I know how hard vintage patterns are. There's a lot of assumptions. There's there was no gauge in a lot of them. There weren't really pattern standards or formats. So I was so impressed that that was your thing. You were taking these very cryptic vintage patterns and turning them into something that you would wear. And you had a beautiful sweater on. And I know that it's hard to go up to someone and ask them something. I feel the same way when approaching new designers. It's almost like asking someone out on a date, right? And I thought this woman clearly she she loves vintage patterns. She loves what she's doing. She's my kind of person. Absolutely. Why wouldn't I say yes?
That's the best way to end this. I mean, you can't do better than that. Thank you so much. I
Thank
mean,
you
it's
so much.
really fun to meet you in person.
It's a great guild. You have a wonderful guild. And we were talking about me coming back teaching. You were talking about color. And the science and theory of color to me is one of the most fascinating things. And I lecture about it a lot because a lot of people struggle with it. So I'm hoping that I will be back in person, to see you three-dimensionally, and teach for your guild again.
Well, I hope so too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. you. Have a great day.
You too. Thanks for being here.